Well, the EU knew this was coming. In fact, this originates from an EU law that the EU is putting in place itself. So this is a pre-clearance procedure for visa waiver countries. So that is countries that are able to visit as tourists without having to get a visa ahead of time. These have been increasingly popular in Western developed countries over the past 15 years, starting when the United States put in place the ESTA system in 2009. So any European who's been to the United States over the past 15 years knows that beforehand they had to fill out this application before they could board the plane. It costs $21 and it can take a couple of days to process. If you show up at the airport without that being done, the airline will turn you around, say go home, come back in a couple of days. When that was implemented in 2009, members of the European Parliament were furious about that. Actually, they passed a resolution saying this was a visa in all but name, and the EU should apply this to American tourists as well. Well, it took many years, but eventually they did pass that legislation several years ago now. The implementation of that EU version of ESTA, which is ETIAS, has been delayed and delayed and delayed, but it's supposed to go into effect next year. And that's where the UK comes in. The UK, as a member of the EU, voted for ETIAS. They voted for this visa waiver scheme. So now when they left the EU, they decided to still continue with that, but as their own country, not as part of the EU. And that means that it's not only Americans who will have to pay this £10, but also people from all European countries. So the whole scheme, this one with the Gulf states, that was a trial of the system, and now it's really going to kick in hardcore in November when it starts applying to Americans, and then from next year to Europeans. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're starting to apply this to Europeans at the same time that ETIAS for the EU would start applying to British people who would have to start paying €7 to come into the EU. I have a feeling that over the next months there's going to be some negotiations to try to get an exemption both ways for EU citizens going to the UK and UK citizens going to the EU. That there is precedent for that. For instance, Canadians don't have to get an ESTA when they go to the United States, and vice versa. Canada also has a version of this. So there is precedent with some other countries that they would exempt their closest neighbors. I have a feeling that's what both sides want to do. I remember the last time I talked to people in Brussels about this, they said that they didn't really have any interest in exempting the UK. There's no country exempted from ETIAS right now. However, there's a new government in the UK that I think is a little bit more friendly, a little bit more receptive to talks. So we'll see if by the time that deadline of April next year comes, will have worked out an agreement to exempt each other from each other's schemes.
I was going to say that new Prime Minister is Keir Starmer, who recently went on a reset tour of Berlin and Paris. Again, there's this issue of the timing of why this announcement comes out now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're moving ahead with it. I have a feeling that this is to get some leverage with the EU and signal this is one area. Again, they're looking at kind of small areas where they can come to an agreement here because Labour has drawn red lines about any kind of alignment with the EU. But this is one area where they could reach a deal that would help a lot of people out. The reason this has been delayed so much on the EU side is that it is going to cause chaos. There are going to be a lot of Americans who arrive here in Europe without having gotten their ETIAS, or they'll show up at the airport before they leave and they're going to get turned around. The same thing is going to happen to those Americans going to the UK in November. I find it actually quite interesting that the UK is going to move ahead applying this to Americans before the EU does. That could have some interesting effect in Americans kind of moving their tourism dollars over to the EU. I'm surprised actually that they didn't coordinate that to happen at the same time that the EU is going to start charging Americans €7 to enter. So we'll see. It's going to be a delicate dance, I think, with these things. But if the ETIAS experience with the EU has taught us anything, it's that governments are they're nervous about applying this because whenever you apply it, there's going to be pain. There's going to be a lot of people showing up in your country that haven't done it, and you're going to have to turn them around.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what's your gut feeling on this? How much of it is about hurt pride over the US's ESTA scheme, and how much of it is about the €7 and a bit of revenue enhancement?
Personally, I think that if the U.S. had never introduced ESTA in 2009, we wouldn't even be talking about this. It's really unclear why countries that have been deemed to be secure enough to have a visa waiver then need this extra thing in order for people to board the flights. I mean, I think people have a point when they say this is a visa in all but name. And so then what's the point of having a visa waiver system? It's essentially just an online visa. So I think that the back and forth about this, I know that in the case with Canada, it seems very much like they implemented theirs when the U.S. did. I think we can trace all this back to 2009 when the U.S. made that fateful decision to start the ESTA system.
Dave Keating reporting live from a not-so-sunny Brussels. Many thanks for that live update. Stay with us. There's much more to come, more news, plus